December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper watches his steel Predators, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, tear through the American lines. For the first few hours, it feels like the Führer's insane gamble might just work. His elite Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear in Hitler's last great offensive, is creating chaos. But Peiper isn't watching the enemy. He's watching his fuel gauges. Every lurch of his Tiger and Panther tanks drains the precious gasoline that is all that stands between a breakthrough and a frozen, useless pile of steel. The entire offensive, Germany's last hope, is built on audacity, surprise, and a prayer for fuel. They were told that the enemy would supply their advance, that the decadent, weak-willed Americans would simply abandon their vast reserves. And in the snow-covered Belgian forests, Peiper's men would indeed stumble upon an unbelievable prize, a massive American fuel dump. For a moment, it would feel like a miracle, but that miracle was a lie. The discovery wouldn't bring salvation. It would bring a soul-crushing revelation, a mathematical certainty of their own doom, and prove how American logistics would crush Hitler's last hope. By the fall of 1944, the Third Reich was being strangled. In the East, the Red Army was a relentless juggernaut grinding its way toward Berlin. In the West, Allied forces sat on Germany's doorstep. For the German High Command, the situation was catastrophic. But inside Adolf Hitler's mind, it was the canvas for one final, epic masterpiece of destruction. His plan was so audacious, it bordered on delusional. Operation Wacht am Rhein. 3 German armies, spearheaded by his best remaining panzer divisions, would smash through a weak point in the American lines in the Ardennes. They would cross the Meuse River, sever the British and American armies, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. Its capture was everything. Hitler didn't just believe it would cripple the Allied supply chain. He promised his generals that Antwerp's vast stockpiles would re-equip his own starving armies. This reliance on captured supplies wasn't just part of the plan, it was the plan. Germany was bleeding out. Allied bombers had systematically dismantled the Reich's synthetic fuel production, cutting it by a staggering 90%. The great oil fields of Ploesti, Romania, were now in Soviet hands. The effects were everywhere. The once mighty Luftwaffe was grounded. Its advanced jets couldn't fly without kerosene. On the home front, you almost never saw a civilian vehicle. The Gestapo was hunting black market gasoline dealers as if they were traitors. The sheer disparity in numbers tells the story. In 1944, the entire German war economy produced about 33 million barrels of oil. That same year, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels. A single oil field in East Texas outproduced all of German-controlled Europe. While American refineries experimented with byproducts to get rid of excess crude, German quartermasters made agonizing choices about which tanks could move and which had to be left behind. Hitler's generals estimated they had only enough fuel for a third of the journey to Antwerp. The rest, they were told, would be provided by the enemy. The dice were loaded as the panzers rolled into the snow, praying for that miracle. The armored fist of the offensive was the 6th Panzer Army, led by SS General Sepp Dietrich, and its sharpest point was Kampfgruppe Peiper. Peiper and his men were the embodiment of Nazi military ideals, fanatical, battle-hardened, and equipped with some of the most feared fighting vehicles of the war. Their weapons were the apex predators of the German arsenal, the Tiger II and the Panther. The Tiger II, with its thick, sloped armor and monstrous 88mm gun, was practically immune to any Allied tank from the front. The Panther was arguably the war's best all-around tank, but they shared a terrible, unquenchable thirst. Peiper knew each of his Tiger IIs drank roughly 2.5 gallons of gasoline for every single mile it crawled forward. In the rough Ardennes terrain, that number could easily double. For every 1 gallon of fuel an American Sherman burned, a Tiger II burned 3. For a country with no fuel, fielding an army of such gas guzzlers was a paradox born from a flawed philosophy: the belief that superior quality could always defeat inferior quantity. But that philosophy ignores a basic truth. A tank that can't move is just a very expensive pillbox. Keeping them moving was a logistical nightmare. The variety of vehicles in a panzer division, once a strength, now meant different engines needed different fuels and parts. Countless trucks were needed to haul fuel to the front, each one a priority target for the Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, that owned the skies. By December 1944, the German supply chain was a study in desperation. Fuel was siphoned from damaged vehicles. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained. A commander like Peiper might have nearly 100 tanks, but if he only had fuel to move 30, his force was effectively crippled. The plan was for these thirsty predators to live off the land, to feed on the arteries of their enemy. They were hunters sent into the wild, expected to be sustained by their prey. While Germany fought on fumes, America fought a global war on a geyser of petroleum. To the American GY, fuel was like air. It was just always there. The colossal system that made this possible was one of the greatest triumphs of the war. At its heart was the Red Ball Express. When Allied armies advanced so quickly, they outran their supply lines. The solution was a 24/7 convoy of trucks on a one-way loop, roads closed to all other traffic. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks, most of them rugged GMC Jimmies, driven by predominantly African-American soldiers, became the lifeblood of the advance. In just 82 days, they delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself was so massive, it consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep its own trucks moving. A German army group commander would have wept to see that much fuel. But that was just one piece. An even more incredible feat was Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. Flexible, 3-inch pipelines were laid across the English Channel, pumping a continuous, unstoppable river of fuel directly to the continent. From coastal depots, smaller pipelines branched out, following the armies like a circulatory system, pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons a day to the front. The scale is staggering. In late 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe burned through 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily. The U.S. First Army, the very force that would take the German attack, kept a reserve of 3.5 million gallons. One of the larger pipelines alone could deliver 300,000 gallons a day. This wasn't just a numbers advantage, it changed the Allied mindset. American commanders planned operations with the comforting knowledge that fuel was a given. While German generals agonized over every kilometer, American generals planned attacks across entire countries. This rolling tide of petroleum was about to collide with the sputtering advance of the panzers. On December 16th, the Ardennes shattered. The German offensive achieved total surprise. Through the gaps in the American lines poured the men and machines of Kampfgruppe Peiper. The advance was a race against their own fuel tanks. Then, near the village of Honsfeld, they hit the jackpot. Overrunning a rest area for an American armored division, they found it, a U.S. fuel and supply depot. To the fuel-starved German soldiers, it was paradise. After years of scrounging for every drop of foul-smelling ersatz fuel, they stood in a forest that was a monument to industrial plenty. A German officer saw walls of sturdy, American-made jerry cans stacked 10 feet high, forming long corridors through the trees. The air, thick with pine and snow, now carried the sharp, intoxicating scent of high-grade, 80-plus octane gasoline. A world away from the 74-octane fuel their own engines were forced to drink. The initial report was euphoric: 50,000 gallons. This single minor capture was more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months. It was enough to refuel Peiper's entire battle group and power their dash to the Meuse River. The men were ecstatic. They saw it as a sign. The decadent Americans were careless with their wealth, and the disciplined German soldier would seize it for his victory. For a brief moment in that cold forest, it felt like the gamble was paying off. Hope, a resource even scarcer than fuel, flooded through the ranks. They had found their El Dorado. The elation was intoxicating. But as German officers began organizing their miraculous bounty, a cold, unsettling feeling crept in. Among the crates of rations and ammo, they found discarded American newspapers. On the jerry cans themselves, they found shipping manifests. A logistics officer would have looked at these documents with a growing sense of dread. The newspapers were recent. The manifests told an impossible story. These jerry cans, filled with gasoline refined in far-off Texas, had crossed the Atlantic, been unloaded in France, and trucked to this forward depot in less than 6 weeks. This wasn't some forgotten stockpile. This was a single drop from a constantly flowing river. The true psychological collapse came with an even bigger discovery. They learned about the Allied pipeline system. They learned that a single pipe, one of several feeding the front, could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel a day. A German panzer division might burn through that much in a month of intense combat. Here was an invisible tube in the ground that delivered more fuel in 24 hours than an armored division could hope for in 30 days. Suddenly, that 50,000-gallon jackpot seemed pathetic. It wasn't a strategic prize. It was pocket change. It was the equivalent of a millionaire dropping a $20 bill on the sidewalk and not bothering to go back for it. The Americans hadn't lost this fuel. Its loss was a mere inconvenience. For years, German propaganda had painted America as a soft mongrel nation incapable of total war. That lie now lay shattered in the snow. As one German soldier later wrote, there was a profound demoralization, a mix of awe and despair at the sheer material wealth of the American soldier. How could you possibly defeat an enemy who treated a treasure that could save your entire army as little more than a rounding error? The discovery of that fuel dump was the moment they knew, with cold certainty, that the war was already lost. This shift from tactical victory to strategic despair is one of the most fascinating parts of the Battle of the Bulge. It shows that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but on the factory floor and in the minds of the soldiers. If you love these kinds of deep dives into the hidden logistics and psychology of war, take a second to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The true, mind-bending extent of America's power wasn't shown by the fuel the Germans found, but by the fuel they were denied. American commanders made a simple, ruthless calculation. If the Germans needed their fuel, that fuel had to be destroyed. What followed was an act of material destruction so profound, so alien to the German mindset, it was one of the ultimate flexes in military history. Near Stavelot, right in Peiper's path, lay another depot. Not 50,000 gallons. This one held 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's tanks drew closer, a small group of American engineers received their orders. Destroy it all. Imagine the German perspective. Your tanks are running on fumes. Your nation's last hope is grinding to a halt. Then, over the next hill, you see a pillar of black smoke. You hear a roar, and you see American soldiers methodically opening the spigots on thousands of fuel drums, letting the precious liquid pour into ditches and setting it on fire. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the story was the same. American engineers opened valves and tossed in grenades. An estimated 8 million gallons went up in smoke in the first week of the battle alone. That single week of intentional destruction was more gasoline than the German High Command had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible waste. It was like watching a starving man burn down a granary. To the Americans, it was sound doctrine. The loss was trivial. The supply chain was already compensating. On December 17th, the U.S. First Army destroyed 2.2 million gallons. The very next day, 1.8 million gallons were delivered to them. By Christmas Eve, their total fuel reserves had actually increased since the battle began. This act sealed Kampfgruppe Peiper's fate. Blocked by stubborn resistance, their promised fuel now just smoke in the sky, their advance sputtered to a halt near La Glaise. Peiper's mighty Tiger IIs became immobile steel coffins. On Christmas Eve, he was forced to abandon them all. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who started the attack, only 800 made it back to German lines, on foot. They weren't beaten by superior tanks. They were beaten by an empty fuel gauge and an enemy who could afford to fight with fire. When the guns fell silent in January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was hailed as a great American victory. And it was. But it was really won long before the first shot was fired. It was won in the oil fields of Texas, the factories of Detroit, and the shipyards of California. The Ardennes offensive was the death rattle of the German war machine. It threw its last elite troops and best armor into the fight, and lost it all. The most fundamental reason for the failure was logistics. The whole plan was a fantasy built on capturing supplies from an enemy that had too much to lose. Let's go back to that stark contrast. In 1944, the U.S. produced over 50 times more crude oil than Germany. While German industry was bombed into rubble, Ford's Willow Run factory was churning out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. American shipyards were launching cargo ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The battle was the moment this statistical reality became an undeniable psychological truth. It was the brutal end of the romantic notion that superior will could triumph over material disadvantage. The image of the dashing Panzer ace was made obsolete by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express. As Churchill himself said, petrol governed every movement. Stalin was more blunt. The war was decided by engines and octane. The German soldiers who stumbled on that fuel dump thought they had found the key to victory. What they had actually found was a yardstick that measured the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their exhausted nation and the industrial colossus they had so foolishly underestimated. They were fighting with a sword against an enemy wielding a production line. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and the American fuel dumps is a microcosm of the entire Second World War. The discovery of that one stockpile, representing more wealth than a German division could dream of, became a symbol of a war that had moved beyond the battlefield. It was a clash between two systems. One was running on the last fumes of a fanatical ideology. The other was powered by an almost limitless river of industrial production. The German soldiers' shock wasn't just about the fuel, it was the soul-crushing realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to be wasteful on a scale they couldn't even imagine. It proved that in modern war, the greatest weapon isn't always a tank. but the ability to supply it endlessly. What other overlooked aspects of military history do you think deserve a deeper look? Are there other battles where logistics, not tactics, told the real story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into the industrial sinews of war, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.